January 3, 2026. A holding cell in Brooklyn, New York. Nicolás Maduro sits behind bars, waiting for trial on drug trafficking charges. The news cameras captured the moment, the handcuffs, the perp walk, the fallen dictator finally brought to justice. But here's what the cameras did not show. The real story of how Maduro fell is not about Delta Force operators or diplomatic negotiations or international law. It is about something far more fundamental and far more brutal. It is about mathematics. The handcuffs that locked around Maduro's arrests in January 2026 were forged 10 years earlier by economic decisions so catastrophic, so divorced from reality, that they turned the wealthiest nation in South America into a humanitarian disaster zone. This is not a story about politics or ideology. This is a story about what happens when a government tries to defy the laws of economics. When leaders believe they can print prosperity, when an entire nation discovers that you cannot eat oil and you cannot pay soldiers with worthless paper. This is the economic autopsy of Venezuela. The forensic examination of how a country sitting on 300 billion barrels of oil, more than Saudi Arabia, managed to make a cup of coffee cost 3 million bolivars. How they lost 80% of their GDP in a decade without a single foreign bomb falling on their soil. How they turned paradise into a prison that 8 million people fled on foot. To understand why Maduro is in a cell today, we must go back to the moment the trap was set. Not in 2024 when he stole the election, not in 2019 when the lights went out, but in 2013 when he inherited a ticking time bomb disguised as an oil empire. March 2013, Hugo Chavez dies of cancer. His handpicked successor, Nicolás Maduro, a former bus driver turned politician, assumes the presidency. On paper, he inherits one of the most resource-rich nations on Earth. Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves in the world, 300 billion barrels buried beneath the soil. It has fertile agricultural land, a coastline on the Caribbean, an educated population, infrastructure built during decades of oil wealth. It should have been impossible to fail. But Maduro did not inherit a healthy economy. He inherited a patient and late-stage disease, kept alive by oil prices that were artificially high and spending that was mathematically unsustainable. The disease had a name that economists recognized immediately: Dutch disease. Here is how it works. When a country discovers massive oil reserves and begins exporting at scale, enormous amounts of foreign currency flood into the economy. The local currency strengthens dramatically. That makes imports incredibly cheap. Why bother growing tomatoes in Venezuela when you can buy them from Brazil for pennies? Why build factories to manufacture cars when you can import them from Japan at a fraction of the cost of domestic production? So the country stops producing. Agriculture withers. Manufacturing dies. The entire economy becomes a single giant machine with one function: extract oil, sell it, use the dollars to buy everything else. As long as oil prices stay high, the system works. It is a party funded by geology. But the moment oil prices fall, or the moment production declines, the entire structure collapses because there is nothing else holding it up. Venezuela had been living this way for decades. By 2013, oil represented 96% of export earnings. The country imported 70% of its food. It imported consumer goods, medicines, spare parts for machinery, everything. The Venezuelan economy was not an economy. It was a conversion mechanism that turned oil into imports. But Maduro inherited something even worse than dependency. He inherited sabotage. In 2002 and 2003, workers at PDVSA, the state oil company, had gone on strike to protest government interference. The Chavez government responded by firing approximately 19,000 engineers, geologists, and skilled technicians. These were not political bureaucrats. These were the people who knew how to maintain the complex machinery of oil extraction, the high-pressure pumps, the refining equipment, the pipeline networks that stretched for thousands of miles. They were replaced with political loyalists, people selected for their devotion to the revolution rather than their technical expertise. By the time Maduro took power, the infrastructure was rotting from within. Pumps were failing. Pipelines were leaking. Refineries were operating at a fraction of capacity. And no one with the knowledge to fix them remained in the country. Maduro faced a choice: invest billions in maintenance and repairs, which would mean cutting the social programs and subsidies that kept the population loyal, or continue extracting the maximum short-term revenue and hope that oil prices stayed high enough to cover the decay. He chose the second option. And that choice set the timer on the bomb. The bomb detonates. Global oil prices collapse from over $100 per barrel to below $50 in a matter of months. The reasons are complex. Oversupply from American shale production, weakening demand from China, geopolitical maneuvering by Saudi Arabia. But for Venezuela, the cause does not matter. The effect is catastrophic. Government revenue, which was almost entirely dependent on oil, drops by more than half overnight. A rational government would have immediately cut spending to match the new reality. Reduce subsidies, trim the public sector, negotiate with creditors, implement austerity. It would have been painful but survivable. Maduro did the opposite. He kept spending at the same rate, funding social programs, paying off political allies, subsidizing gasoline to 5 cents per gallon, maintaining an inflated public sector. The budget deficit exploded. And to cover that deficit, Maduro turned to the one tool that governments throughout history have used when they run out of money. He printed it. The Central Bank of Venezuela began creating bolivars at an accelerating rate. In 2013, inflation was 56%, high but not catastrophic. By 2015, it reached 180%. By 2016, 254%. And then the system broke completely. In 2018, the IMF estimated inflation at 130,000%. By early 2019, some calculations put it over 300,000%. This is not inflation. This is hyperinflation, the complete destruction of a currency's value. Let me give you a concrete example of what this means. In December 2016, a dozen eggs cost 250 bolivars. By December 2017, that same dozen eggs cost 550,000 bolivars. By November 2018, it cost 17 million bolivars. Prices were not changing by the year or the month or even the day. They were changing by the hour. Restaurants stopped printing menus with prices because the numbers would be wrong before the meal was finished. The bolivar ceased to function as money. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day so they could rush out during lunch and spend their morning wages before they lost half their value by evening. People carried cash in backpacks because you needed bundles of bills just to buy basic groceries. There are photographs from this period that are almost surreal. Children playing with stacks of worthless currency like building blocks because the bills had more value as toys than as money. People weaving purses and bags out of banknotes because the craft value exceeded the monetary value. And what was Maduro's response? Did he acknowledge that printing money to cover deficits was destroying the currency? No. He declared economic war. He blamed merchants for raising prices. He blamed the United States for sabotage. He blamed the opposition for hoarding goods. He sent soldiers into stores with orders to force shopkeepers to sell at government-mandated prices. The soldiers would point guns at a store owner and say, "Sell this television for $10. The shopkeeper would comply. And then he would have no money to restock his inventory because he had just sold a television for less than he paid for it. The shelves went empty. This is the second nail in Venezuela's coffin. The complete destruction of price signals. An economy functions because prices convey information. When something is scarce, the price rises, signaling producers to make more and consumers to use less. When something is abundant, the price falls, signaling the opposite. But when you destroy the currency and criminalize price adjustments, that entire mechanism fails. No one knows what anything is worth. No one can plan. No one can save. Economic activity grinds to a halt. The shelves are empty. The currency is worthless. And then the hunger begins. According to a major university survey conducted in Venezuela, in 2016 alone, 75% of the population lost an average of 19 pounds. Not from exercise, from malnutrition. A dark joke began circulating in Caracas. The Maduro diet. It will make you skinny, but it will not make you healthy. When the economy collapsed and imports stopped, the supermarkets emptied. But the government had a solution. They created something called clap boxes, local supply and production committees. These were cardboard boxes containing subsidized food, rice, flour, canned goods, delivered directly to households. On the surface, it appeared to be humanitarian relief. In reality, it was a leash. If you protested against the government, no box. If you refused to sign lists supporting Maduro, no box. If your neighborhood voted for the opposition in the last election, maybe the truck would break down that week. Food became a weapon of political control, and it became something even darker. It became a business. Alex Saab, Maduro's financial fixer, was arrested in 2020 and eventually extradited to the United States in 2021. The investigations revealed a scheme so cynical it is difficult to comprehend. The government was importing low-quality food, sometimes nutritionally worthless, sometimes expired, at massively inflated prices. They would buy powdered milk from Mexico that contained almost no actual milk, just filler and chemicals. They would bill the Venezuelan state millions of dollars for these shipments. And then they would pocket the difference. While Venezuelan children were fainting in schools from hunger, while hospitals reported patients dying from starvation-related complications, the inner circle of the regime was accumulating wealth by profiting from that very hunger. They turned starvation into a revenue stream. Think about the moral calculation required for that. You destroy the currency so people cannot buy food. You destroy domestic agriculture so they cannot grow food. And then you tell them, if you kneel and obey, we will feed you. Maybe. This created a psychological break in Venezuelan society. You cannot organize a protest when you are malnourished. You cannot plan a revolution when your children are hungry. The weaponization of food did what no amount of propaganda or repression could accomplish. It broke the spirit of the population. But when the food runs out, when the hunger becomes unbearable, people do not riot. They leave. The exodus begins in earnest. Since 2014, approximately 7.7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. That represents roughly 25% of the entire population. To put that in perspective, imagine if every single person in the state of Texas left. Imagine if the entire nation of Switzerland packed up and crossed the border. This is the largest refugee crisis in the modern history of the Western Hemisphere, larger than the Syrian crisis at certain points. And unlike Syria, there was no civil war. There were no bombs. The disaster was entirely economic. The bomb was inflation. The bomb was hunger. The bomb was the realization that the government had destroyed the future and there was no reason to stay. And who left? Doctors, because a surgeon's monthly salary in Venezuela had dropped to $6. Engineers, because there was no infrastructure to build or maintain. Teachers, because schools had no supplies and no students. Oil technicians, the very people needed to repair the broken machinery, fled to Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, the United States. Picture a hospital in Caracas in 2019. A patient needs emergency surgery. The power goes out because the electrical grid has failed. The backup generator does not start because someone stole the fuel and the spare parts. And the surgeon who is supposed to perform the operation is not there. He is in Miami, washing dishes at a restaurant, because $6 per month cannot feed his family. This is the hidden cost that ultimately destroyed Maduro's regime. He did not just lose money, he lost human capital. He lost the knowledge, the skills, the expertise needed to repair the damage. When the oil rigs broke down, the engineers who could fix them were in Houston. When the power grid collapsed, the electrical technicians were in Madrid. He was left ruling a country of ghosts, elderly people too old to flee, and those too poor to afford the journey. And the journey was brutal. Hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans walked across the Darien Gap, one of the most dangerous jungles on earth, through swamps and mountains, risking disease and violence just for a chance to reach the United States or another country that might offer safety. The images of mothers carrying children through rivers, families sleeping on roadsides, spread across global media. The regime could claim that Venezuela was a socialist paradise. But when a quarter of your population would rather risk death in a jungle than remain in your paradise, the propaganda collapses. The exodus did two things. Initially, it relieved pressure. Fewer mouths to feed meant less unrest. But eventually, it became a source of profound humiliation and strategic weakness. Those millions of Venezuelans abroad became the loudest voices calling for international intervention. They sent remittances back home, $20 transfers that kept families alive, while simultaneously lobbying foreign governments to impose sanctions, to freeze assets, to isolate the regime. The diaspora became Maduro's greatest enemy because they were living proof that his system had failed. March 2019. The infrastructure finally breaks. For days, rumors had been circulating that the electrical grid was on the verge of collapse. Then, on March 7th, it happened. The Guri Dam, one of the largest hydroelectric facilities in the world, which supplies 80% of Venezuela's electricity, failed. The country went dark, not for an hour, not for a day, for nearly a week. Imagine you are in an elevator on the 20th floor when the power cuts. Imagine you are on a subway train deep underground. Imagine you are a surgeon, scalpel in hand, about to make an incision, and the lights go out. That is what happened across an entire nation. Maduro immediately declared that this was a cyber attack orchestrated by the United States. He claimed, without evidence, that Marco Rubio had personally directed hackers to sabotage the dam. But the engineers, the few who remained, knew the truth: negligence. For years, the electrical system had been starved of maintenance. Substations were overgrown with vegetation that caught fire. Transformers had not been replaced. Turbines were operating beyond their designed lifespan. The system had been held together with improvisation and hope, and finally, it gave up. When the power died, everything that depended on electricity died with it. The water pumps stopped. This is a tropical country where temperatures regularly exceed 90 degrees Fahrenheit. No air conditioning, no fans, and now no water. People were seen on television news scooping water from the Gare River, which is so polluted it is essentially an open sewer, just to have something to flush their toilets. But the real horror was in the hospitals. Neonatal incubators, which keep premature babies alive, shut down. Dialysis machines which filter blood for patients with kidney failure stopped. Ventilators ceased functioning. We will never know the exact death toll from those 5 days. The government certainly will not release accurate numbers. But doctors reported that patients died simply because the machines keeping them alive had no power. This was the moment when the economic collapse became a direct, physical threat to life. The state had failed to provide the two most basic requirements of civilization: light and water. And yet, in a twist of irony that borders on the absurd, the regime found a way to survive. They realized that the Bolivar was dead. So to stay in power, they embraced the one thing they had spent years denouncing: the United States dollar. By 2020, Venezuela had become a surreal economic landscape. Walk down one street in Caracas and you would see people digging through garbage for food. Walk down the next street and you would see a gleaming new store, a bodegon, selling Nutella, imported wine, PlayStation consoles, and premium steaks. How is this possible in a country where 90% of the population lives in poverty? Because Maduro quietly, without any formal announcement, legalized the use of the US dollar. For years, the government had maintained strict currency controls. It was illegal to buy or sell dollars without government permission. The official exchange rate was absurdly disconnected from reality. But by 2019, the regime simply gave up trying to control the currency. They stopped enforcing the rules because enforcement was impossible. The bolivar was so worthless that people refused to use it. And so the dollar became the de facto currency of Venezuela. This created a two-tier economy. 95% of the population earns their income in bolivars, which are worth essentially nothing. 5%, government cronies, military officers, people with family abroad sending remittances, have access to dollars. That 5% can afford the imported goods in the bodegons. The other 95% starve. It is an economy built on money laundering and remittances. The government is not producing anything. They are washing drug money and stolen gold through luxury imports, creating the illusion of normalcy for a tiny elite while the masses suffer. This raises the obvious question. If the oil industry is dead, if they are not collecting taxes because the formal economy has collapsed, where is the regime getting cash to pay the military? How do you keep generals loyal when you cannot pay them in a currency that holds value? The answer takes us to the darkest chapter of this story. When the oil money ran out, Maduro turned the Venezuelan Amazon into an open-pit gold mine. The Arco Minero del Orinoco. The Orinoco Mining Arc, a region larger than Portugal, one of the most biodiverse places on the planet, home to indigenous tribes who have lived there for thousands of years. In 2016, Maduro declared it a special economic zone open for mineral extraction. But this was not industrial mining with environmental safeguards and labor protections. This was the Wild West. The regime handed control of vast territories to a mix of military officers and criminal organizations, including Colombian guerrilla groups like the ELN. These groups use mercury to separate gold from ore. Mercury is a neurotoxin. It is highly poisonous. It does not break down in the environment. It accumulates in the food chain. The mercury flows into the rivers, poisoning the water supply for indigenous communities downstream. It contaminates the fish that people depend on for protein. Children are being born with developmental disorders caused by mercury exposure. Entire ecosystems are being destroyed. And the gold? It is flown out on private planes to Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, places that do not ask questions. It is sold for cash, off the books, no receipts, no taxes, no transparency. Bags of cash are delivered directly to the presidential palace to keep the inner circle happy and to pay the generals enough to ensure they do not stage a coup. By 2024, Venezuela was no longer functioning as a state. It was a criminal enterprise pretending to be a government. The economy was not based on GDP or productivity. It was based on extraction. Extract the remaining oil, extract the gold. Extract remittances from desperate families abroad. Extract the last bits of hope. But even crime pays the bills for only so long. Eventually you run out of things to steal. You run out of allies willing to protect you. And that brings us to the final mistake, the decision that sealed Maduro's fate. For the first time in years, there was a whisper of hope. Inflation, while still catastrophic, had slowed. Oil production had stabilized at low levels because the United States, under pressure from energy prices, had granted Chevron a limited license to operate in Venezuela. There was talk of a deal, the Barbados Agreement. The terms were straightforward. Venezuela would hold free and fair elections in July 2024. International observers would be allowed to monitor the process. In exchange, the United States and the European Union would begin lifting sanctions. Oil could be sold again. Foreign investment could return. The economy could breathe. July 28, 2024, Election Day. The opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, was not a revolutionary firebrand. He was a mild-mannered diplomat, a compromise candidate. But he represented something Maduro could not tolerate, an exit. The polls were clear. Gonzalez was winning by overwhelming margins. Exit polls suggested a 70-30 split in some regions. The people had spoken. They wanted change. Maduro faced a choice. Option A: accept the results. Negotiate a transition that includes amnesty for him and his inner circle. Retire to a friendly country with the millions of dollars he had siphoned abroad. Let Venezuela begin the long process of recovery. Option B: steal the election. Refuse to release the detailed vote tallies. Declare himself the winner despite all evidence to the contrary. Arrest protesters. And guarantee that the sanctions remain in place forever. He chose option B. He announced that he had won. He refused to provide precinct-level results that would prove his claim. He deployed security forces to crush protests. And in that moment, the economic lifeline was severed. The United States immediately announced that the deal was off. Sanctions snapped back into place. The European Union followed. Foreign investors who had been cautiously exploring opportunities in Venezuela withdrew. The generals who had been promised that economic recovery was coming realized they had been lied to. This was the moment that sealed Maduro's fate. Because up until 2024, he had an excuse. He could blame American imperialism. He could blame sanctions. He could argue that Venezuela's suffering was the result of external aggression. But in 2024, he was handed a golden key to unlock the sanctions, to restore oil exports, to allow the economy to function again, and he threw that key into the ocean. He chose personal power over national survival. He proved to the world, and more importantly to his own military, that as long as he remained in power, Venezuela would never recover. And when a general cannot pay his troops because the president is an international pariah, when the only source of income is illegal gold mining and drug trafficking, when there is a $15 million bounty on the president's head, loyalty becomes a mathematical equation. Protect Maduro and go down with a sinking ship. Or hand him over and maybe, just maybe, cut a deal that allows you to keep some of the money and avoid life in prison. The Cartel of the Suns. Cartel de los Soles. That is what U.S. investigators called it. The name comes from the insignia worn by Venezuelan generals, a sun emblem on their epaulets. For years, the U.S. Department of Justice had been building a case. The allegation, confirmed through wiretaps, informants, and intercepted communications, was that the Venezuelan government had become a logistics hub for cocaine trafficking. Think about it from a practical standpoint. If you are a drug trafficker, your biggest challenge is avoiding law enforcement. You have to smuggle your product past police, coast guards, radar systems. But what if you are the police? What if you control the radar, the ports, the airstrips, the entire security apparatus of a nation? Then cocaine trafficking becomes easy. It becomes a state enterprise. Venezuelan military planes were allegedly flying cocaine to Honduras and Mexico. Venezuelan ports were used to load drugs onto ships bound for Europe. And the profits were split between the cartels and the generals. This was not some rogue operation. According to U.S. prosecutors, this was policy. The state had become a narco-state. And Nicolás Maduro, according to the indictment issued in 2020, was the kingpin. The U.S. placed a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head. $15 million. Think about what that means psychologically. Every time Maduro walked into a room surrounded by his bodyguards, he had to wonder, does that soldier want to protect me? Or does he want $15 million? When the economy is bankrupt, when you cannot pay salaries, when the only thing holding the system together is fear and fading loyalty, $15 million is an extraordinarily attractive number. The narco-state model also had another fatal flaw. It isolated Venezuela completely. Even allies began to distance themselves. China, which had lent Venezuela billions, stopped extending new credit. Brazil, even under a leftist government, refused to publicly support Maduro after the 2024 election theft. Russia, preoccupied with its own wars, could offer only rhetorical support. No one wants to do business with a government under active drug trafficking indictment by the United States Department of Justice. It is bad for business. It invites sanctions. It makes you radioactive. By late 2025, the walls were closing in. The oil money was gone. The gold mines were being squeezed by international pressure. Drug routes were being interdicted. And most critically, the cash flow to the military was drying up. Reports began to surface that in the final months of 2025, the payments to top generals were arriving late. Or they were smaller than expected. The incentive structure that had kept the regime alive for a decade was breaking down. January 3, 2026. The details are still emerging. What we know is that Nicolás Maduro was arrested and extradited to the United States to face charges related to drug trafficking and corruption. The official story involves cooperation from elements within the Venezuelan military and intelligence services. The reality, when it is fully revealed, will likely show that the final act came down to economics. When you can no longer pay the people with guns, when those people realize they have more to gain by handing you over than by protecting you, the game is over. Dictatorships can survive being hated. They can survive international condemnation. They can even survive attempted coups if the military remains loyal. But they cannot survive when the military's loyalty has a price tag, and someone else is offering a better price. Maduro's capture was not primarily about justice or democracy or human rights, though those things matter. It was about incentives. It was about the mathematics of loyalty versus self-preservation. For 10 years, the calculation for Venezuela's generals was simple: protect Maduro, stay in power, keep the money flowing. But by January 2026, the calculation had changed. Protect Maduro, stay isolated forever, risk being indicted yourself. Or cooperate with his removal, maybe negotiate immunity, maybe keep some of the stolen wealth. When the economic math changes, so does political reality. So here we are. Nicolás Maduro sits in a cell in Brooklyn awaiting trial. But let us be clear about what actually brought him down. It was not ideology. It was not foreign intervention, though that played a role. It was not military might. It was the refusal to accept economic reality. He believed you could print wealth. You cannot. He believed you could destroy the currency without consequences. You cannot. He believed you could rule over ruins forever as long as you controlled the guns. You cannot. Here is the final autopsy report on the Venezuelan economy under Maduro. GDP contracted by approximately 80%. This is one of the worst economic collapses in peacetime history, comparable only to situations like the Great Depression or the collapse of the Soviet Union. Poverty reached over 90% of the population at its peak. Migration exceeded 7.7 million people, 1/4 of the entire population. Currency destruction so complete that the bolivar effectively ceased to exist as a functioning medium of exchange. There will be trials. There will be legal proceedings. There will be debates about justice and accountability. But there is no courtroom large enough to hold the true scale of what the Venezuelan people endured. You cannot sue for a lost decade. You cannot get compensation for a childhood spent hungry. You cannot recover the years stolen from 8 million people who had to flee their homeland on foot. The economy that destroyed Maduro also destroyed Venezuela. He may be gone, but the wreckage remains. The oil infrastructure is ruined and will take decades and billions of dollars to repair. The electrical grid is unreliable. The healthcare system is non-existent. An entire generation has lost their education. The professionals who could rebuild the country are scattered across the world, and many will never return. This is the true cost of economic fantasy. This is what happens when leaders believe they can ignore mathematics, when they think loyalty can be purchased with worthless paper, when they prioritize power over the basic functioning of a society. The Venezuelan collapse is a case study, a warning, a monument to what not to do. Every decision Maduro made, from printing money to firing skilled workers to weaponizing hunger to stealing elections, was a nail in his own coffin and a nail in the coffin of millions of innocent people. The lights will come back on in Venezuela eventually. The economy will recover someday. But the scars will last for generations. Because you cannot delete 80% of an economy and expect people to forget. You cannot starve a population and expect them to forgive. The autopsy is complete. The cause of death, economic suicide. And the lesson, if anyone is willing to learn it, is that no amount of oil, no amount of gold, no amount of military force can save you when the numbers stop adding up. Economics is not just about money. It is about life. And in Venezuela, bad economics killed millions of futures before a single person was ever put in handcuffs.